Great pleasure of starting off by introducing our first speaker, James Tong. James is really going to talk big picture here to get us started with the conversation today. He'll talk about the energy transition, the future grid, and how energy storage fits into all of that. By way of introduction, James Tong is a Vice President of Strategy and Government Affairs at Clean Power Finance. Are slides loaded? Leading their initiatives to reduce solar soft cost and develop strategies to integrate renewables into the grid. James is also a principal in an unprecedented big data analysis led by NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, studying consumer solar adoption. You may have seen James' papers that he's co-authored with former FERC Chairman John Wellinghoff relating to distributed energy resources and utility reforms, and he's a frequent speaker at many other industry forums. James has a BA in economics from Yale and an MBA from the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. James Tong.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's always a privilege to speak at Minnesota. It's kind of my adopted home state. Today I'm going to go very high level about storage and let everybody understand why is storage so revolutionary, at least cost-effective storage is revolutionary. And before we get into that, let's talk about storage in general and the benefits of storage. We often think of storage as being batteries, but let's put this in perspective about the storage throughout the history of mankind. I mean, we had hard drives more recently. We have refrigeration. We have currency. We have writing. And the point is not to speak about each of these technologies, but to remind people what are the advantages of having storage. One of the advantages is that you could consume as needed. You don't have to have a coincidence of supply and demand. This is true with currency when we used to barter all the time. This was true with refrigeration where you had to cook and then eat almost simultaneously. This consumption of as needed also provides flexibility on how you arrange your daily life, how you arrange your priorities. It also adds portability. You can now take some value, transfer it somewhere else, and consume it at a later time. It leads to greater efficiency. With that flexibility then, you could then plan your life in the most efficient way and use resources most efficiently. It's also a hedge against uncertainty. When you have to consume as quickly as supply comes, there's a lot of uncertainty. Your demand is very inelastic. Now, with storage, you could say, well, I could save for a rainy day and consume later. I think most importantly, it enables innovation. I mean, how many of us have, smartphones? And a lot of the reason why smartphones have been so ubiquitous and we have so many apps is because we have storage that allows us to move around and use as needed. Now, the challenge with the grid is that the grid doesn't take advantage of the advantages of storage. The grid is required to have a balance between supply and demand at all times. This makes demand very inelastic, and therefore, because the demand is very inelastic and because electricity is a public good, it is highly regulated. So electricity markets do not behave like most markets, and because of that, I would argue that the innovation, the portability, the flexibility just doesn't exist in the electric markets. Now, things are changing. I know a lot of us think of storage, we think of batteries, and that was pretty clear in the poll. But we got to keep in mind storage is more than just batteries. And you see on the top is the Powerwall, which has been getting a lot of news with Elon Musk's launch. And if you look at the economics of the Powerwall, as great as it is, it's only to serve a limited segment. We need more cost-effective storage. Other examples of storage, and they generally fall into three different categories. There's chemical storage, mechanical, and thermal. And in fact, the biggest source of storage right now is what we call hydroelectricity or pump hydropower. What that means is that we use the potential energy of water in a reservoir and we hold it, and as time and when we need it, we run the water and that generates electricity. Pump storage takes it a step further by pumping water back up into the reservoir, wait till we need it, and then run the water and creates electricity. Now, this is the most abundant use of storage, but the challenge there is that it's location dependent. There are only few sources in the world where pump storage, hydroelectricity works. Now, it works wonders in the Scandinavian countries, like, for example, in Denmark, where they're pretty much on 100% renewables. They could do that because they have a lot of cost-effective storage. In the United States, it will be very hard. So we will have to look at other forms of storage, and other forms can include compressed air energy storage, flywheels, but also include thermal storage. And in fact, what we heard recently is NRG is partnering with I think Southern California Edison, where you basically freeze ice. And then because of the properties of ice, you can then use that coolness to use AC much later in the day when the grid is under most strain. Keep in mind that the grid is it fluctuates quite tremendously. The peak demand is generally around when we go home from work, and that's when AC is being used the most. So if we can shift when we charge our AC to the time we consume, we could lead to greater grid efficiency. Similarly, latent heat thermal energy storage is the opposite. You could heat up, say, molten salts and store that energy, and this is what is done with concentrated solar power. And what it does there is that you have a lot of heat that's generated during the daytime, is stored at nighttime, and then during the nighttime when there's no renewables, you could use that heat to create steam that spins the turbines to create electricity. And the advantage of all the storage is that it allows for us to shift consumption patterns. Instead of having so much peak demand in the evening, we can now flatten the peak. And I will get into that a little bit more. But we got to put this in context of what's going on with the grid. Storage will be a wonderful, it is a wonderful thing, but it has long been, let's be clear, we've always pursued storage. Storage has always been that unicorn that's been very elusive. But I think storage is becoming more necessary now because the grid is evolving. And let me give you a little perspective of what's happening on the grid. In the past, we had different components of the grid. There's power generation, big generators. Then we have transmission networks. Then we have distribution networks that takes the big power lines, step it down, and brings it to your local home. And this is where you get to the consumers, or quote-unquote ratepayers. As you can see, the first part operates in the wholesale. The second part operates in the retail market. Direction's always been one way. That's the flow of electricity. And the way the markets have worked is that now power generation is oftentimes in the market realm, and transmission is done through what they call RTOs or ISOs. But the distribution network is a highly regulated utility. It's a monopoly provider, and there's good reasons why we have that, precisely because energy is a necessary commodity, and that supply and demand has to be matched at all times. We can't, the fear is that if we let markets do that function, we will have a mismatch of supply and demand, which could lead to blackouts or blowouts of transformers. So that's why it's highly regulated. And finally, we get to the end customer. Now, what's going on is something quite extraordinary and revolutionary. We have things going the opposite direction. Demand-side, customer-sided resources, collectively known as distributed energy resources, they're providing resources back into the grid. So it's flowing the opposite way. And this is creating a lot of strain, both politically and to some extent on a technical level, because the grid was never designed for two-way flows. In fact, the economics was never designed for two-way flows. Ratepayers were just consumers that took from the grid. Now ratepayers are quote-unquote prosumers. Not only do they take from the grid, but they can provide grid services. And in turn, they expect compensation for those grid services. How do we compensate for those grid services? That's the debate that we are seeing right now with net metering, with demand response. We don't know exactly what's the fair compensation. And we're not right now prepared for that. And storage will be both a blessing and a curse, because storage will provide tremendous grid services, but at the same time, How do we compensate for storage? And this is something we will explore in this conference here. Keep in mind, storage is one of several emerging technologies. What you're seeing is I'm showing you a list of different technologies. We have smart grid technologies, microgrids, smart homes, EVs. These are a bunch of technologies that will be enabled by storage. Now, we've got to put in this perspective, and this will be covered in a later section, is that the grid is evolving away from what we know as a waterfall system, where you start from a centralized generator, you waterfall down to a transmission, you waterfall down to a distribution. Now what you're seeing is a network, just like the internet. Things go in multiple directions. Consumers could potentially then sell to other consumers. Businesses could sell to businesses. Businesses can sell back to the utilities. Again, the grid was never prepared for this. But the advantage of such a network, it is become more efficient. And to enable such a network, storage will probably play a key factor. And keep in mind what I mean by network. Think about your internet. You have your home network. And then you may have a network within like a service provider like Facebook. And then beyond that, there's a network of friends of different websites. And beyond that, you have a network of different internet service providers. You have a network of Netflix. The grid may someday possess a similar network. You have a home network where all your appliances are wired. Then you have a network with a microgrid. And then you have a series of microgrid that will plug into the utilities. And then the utilities themselves, the distribution utility can provide its own network that bid into the transmission grid. This is a very revolutionary concept. And right now, regulation is not prepared to answer all those questions, but you can see that there is so much promise in a network because it leads to more efficiency, greater reliability, and less use of big resources, and engages the consumers in a way that we've never engaged consumers before. In the past, consumers have always been quote-unquote ratepayers. They've been passive participants. Now we get consumers to be an active participant who can then use their resource for the benefits of the grid and the benefits of others. So yes, cost-effective storage will empower consumers and protect against network irregularities. And what I mean by network irregularities is that to make sure the network operates correctly, the utilities have a tough job. They got to make sure the voltage is correct, the frequency correct, the supply and demand is always the same. What storage does is now it acts like a buffer. So if there's some irregularity and you have storage nearby, you could then send some grid services to balance out the frequency. And this is, in many ways, this is how the internet works. The internet can be very disruptive, but we have what they call cache technology, where certain data is stored on the side, and if that data line is cut off, it pulls from the cache technology. So for the user experience, this is a seamless, uninterrupted experience. Storage is the same way. If something gets interrupted, if a line gets cut off, there's a distributed storage system that gets feed into your home, and you will not even notice that there's a blackout. Now, these are all promises. To make it a reality, we have to just create the right policies. And this is a chart. This is maybe an eyesore, but and let me explain what's going on here. Storage can increase grid efficiency. What we see on the left-hand side is a real-time pricing from PJM. And what you see is what the rates are. And you can see how the rates fluctuate wildly in a given day. Like you can see the rates being up to $450 per megawatt hour, which is very expensive. But you, as a consumer, are charged the same flat retail rate regardless of what the utilities are buying that power. And what that means is that you are being obscured from the inefficiency of the system. When you don't see the pricing mechanism, people consume more than they should, and they consume less when they shouldn't. And what's happening here is that the utilities are overbuilding on generation plants. In order to accommodate that peak demand, they have to have standby generation power. Well, having that standby generation power is extremely expensive. Think about our highway system. Think about if we had to build our highway system big enough that we make sure that the flow of traffic is the same during peak hours as it is during 3 a.m. in the morning. what we'll create is an infrastructure that has too much capacity in many ways, and that's what's happening. What you're seeing on the right-hand side is how much capacity we have. What this shows is that the difference between peak and average capacity. So you see what that means is that at 1.89, what that means is that during peak capacity, you're using 89% more energy than you are at an average time. So that also means that on average, that 89% capacity is not being used. And that's extremely expensive. So what storage can do is smooth out these peaks, shift people's consumption, lower the cost, lower the need for standby generation. It could create more dynamic pricing where we signal to people, hey, you can consume at different times of days. I think that the reason why we don't have dynamic pricing is that the prices fluctuate so much, and regulators are afraid to expose that pricing fluctuation to the average consumer. It's just a very unpopular thing to do. Now with storage, you can still expose that pricing signal, but with energy being stored, that pricing signal won't affect you. Let's just say suddenly the price goes way up. I could now use storage and avoid those type of costs. With storage, you create more elastic demand. And when you have more elastic demand, it creates, the electric industry could behave more like markets, which means that, for example, if you see high peak demand, hey, I could choose not to turn on my dishwasher or turn on my AC. I could just pull from the storage system. And that's the advantage of storage. Now, on a more global scale, storage can help greatly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is a chart from the EPA. As you can see, electricity sector is the largest source of greenhouse gas, followed by transportation. Well, on the first order effect, what you see is the electrification of transportation. The more we have cost-effective storage, the more we could have more EVs. Part of the reason, one of the biggest barriers to adoption of EVs is that it's expensive. And the reason why it's expensive? Because the batteries are expensive. Better batteries will open the EV markets to more people. But this will not reduce greenhouse gas emissions alone. Even to electrify the transportation, you need cleaner sources. If it's using dirty sources to produce the electricity, electrifying the transportation will not necessarily reduce greenhouse gases. This goes to my second point. Storage can facilitate the deployment of greener sources, which includes wind, which includes solar. One of the challenge of these type of technology, one is cost, but the other important part is intermittent energy, variable energy. The sun doesn't shine all the time. Wind doesn't blow all the time. So to rely on those sources is unreliable. Utilities must rely on thermal generators, which they could turn on and turn off as needed. Now with storage, we can use more renewable energy because we could store that energy, and then when the sun is not shining, use that energy as needed. So as you can see, storage can facilitate not just reduction of greenhouse gases, it can reduce other pollutants like carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, and sulfur dioxide. I guess my parting words is that we need to get policies right. The question is, how do we get more cost-effective storage? Well, of course, we need more R&D in storage to lower costs. But more cost-effective storage also means not just lowering the cost, but raising the value of storage. And we're focused on lowering the cost, but we're ignoring the value. And the value is everything I have outlined before. It means the value is more flexibility, more portability, more green energy. These are values that are largely ignored in our planning process. And when we do these planning process, we need to take a holistic approach. Just focusing just on storage will not be enough. You have to look at how storage works with other technology, because only then can you realize the synergies of storage and say with solar or storage with wind. And I also say that we need more market mechanisms. I know market mechanism makes people scary because they think of deregulation, but in fact, storage can help with market mechanisms because you can create more dynamic rates. One of the things that Enron learned was that because there was not enough storage, and because there was not dynamic rates, they could create artificial shortage. What they do is that they pretend that there was not enough electricity, and since demand is very inelastic, people bid very high, and that pretty much almost bankrupt a lot of the utilities in Southern California. Now with storage, if Enron had tried that and said, okay, let's try to create this artificial storage, well, one, the dynamic prices will signal to consumers that let's reduce consumption, but the flip side is consumers or other businesses say, well, I'm not going to buy from the utility, I'm just going to use my storage. That would actually hurt Enron, so it would prevent market manipulation like what Enron did. I think the most important thing, and you hear this in the debate with distributed generation, you hear this with demand response, is that we need more transparent and universal principles to fairly evaluate all sources, all resources. We're talking about the value of solar, which is, I think, is a great start to that. The challenge there is that do we then start creating a value of solar with storage, a value of solar with demand response? I'm not sure if it's particularly scalable. I think what we need to develop is a more scalable way to fairly evaluate the different resources that people can provide to the grid. In that regards, we probably need a neutral grid operator, because the grid operator has all the values, and they'll tell you, well, storage doesn't work here, and many people will not believe them because they're housed under a utility who has a profit motive, and they will have a natural incentive to feed you information that will benefit their shareholders and not necessarily the consumer. And I think the most important thing is we need to focus on the what and versus the who. A lot of the debate you see with solar is who gets to do it, how much they get paid. We haven't really asked, well, where is solar most beneficial? Should we be doing solar in the first place? And what we see is the grid, the value of solar does vary significantly depending on the different locations in the grid. Solar may not be valuable in places like, who knows, North Dakota, but it's certainly valuable in California. So to have a blanket categorization say solar is needed throughout the country, well, it's missing the point. What we had to say was, for California, what is needed? And then once we decide what is needed, let's talk about who is best capable of doing that. In some cases, it could be the utilities. In other cases, it may not be the utilities. And we have to accept that, and we have to develop a regulatory process that fairly evaluates the what, and then the who, and then the how much. So I think at the end of the day, we've been talking about the utility model for a century has been focused on centralized generation provided by a monopoly provider. We're moving to a world where we're having distributed resources, things all across the grid, and they may be on the demand side from the consumer. And what regulation must learn is how to optimize those resources against the supply side resources. And with that, I am finished. Sure.
Right. So because we're being taped, I need to use a microphone. So hopefully this one is live. And I've just got my first question for James. Thank you. Okay, great question. So, James, you mentioned that you think we need a neutral grid operator, and I think you're talking about at the distribution level.
That's correct.
And is this similar to the role of the ISOs and the RTOs?
Correct. So the ISO and the RTOs is a neutral grid operator for the transmission grid, where it allows different generators to bid into the market. And what we're seeing is that there will be many suppliers on the distribution grid, so we'll need a neutral grid operator. Now, John Wellinghoff and I have argued that it should be an independent distribution system operator similar to the RTO, but that's not necessarily the only way of establishing that. Other forms that I've heard is, for example, you could have the grid operator within the utility, but having standards of conduct and regulatory oversight that make sure that the grid operator is neutral. Another model posed by some other regulatory gurus, including Scott Hempling, is you have a competition for the grid operator, much the same way you have a competition for who for example, runs your trash. I mean, you give a franchise for 10 years. If they don't serve the public well, then you give the franchise to somebody else. So there are different models out there, but yes, ultimately, having a neutral grid operator is the best way to ensure that not only grid utility resources get used fairly, but also so customer resources get used fairly.
Okay, I'm trying to read these questions. Okay, great. So practically and politically, how do you suggest a transition from the integrated monopoly utility system that we have to this sort of grid operator? And I think I would ask that more specifically, in Minnesota, how could we evolve in a way that incorporates the utility as the maintainer of the grid?
Sure. And let me preface that. I do believe there is a role for utilities. I'm not saying the utilities should go away, but we got to define what the utilities is about. And I think more importantly, what are we all here for? It's not necessary to preserve utilities. We're here to deliver the maximum value to end consumers. That's period. Now, utilities will play a role in that, but given the new technology, we have to understand that suppliers could also provide that value. So I think the most first and foremost is something what we're doing already in Minnesota is E21 and say, wait a minute, centralized supply side resources may not be the only method of delivering value to the consumer. There are other ways. I think the other thing you have to look to is allow for a little more competition, or not necessarily competition, but allow for more options for consumers to basically choose what resources are available. And it could be the case where the grid, and this is a model that we've argued, John Wellinghoff and I, the utilities will be the owners of the grid, but it'll be the platform for a lot of technologies. Think about the App Store. Think about the iPhone. The most valuable piece of the iPhone is the hardware. But on top of the iPhone, there are plenty of app providers. Plenty of technologists, innovators that deliver value to consumers. And through that, consumers can pick and choose what's best for them. As long as they don't impede or add cost to other consumers, they should be allowed to maximize the value of how they consume energy, just like I'm allowed to maximize the value of how I engage with my app store. So there needs to be a change in mindset saying, hey, I think there's a bias that where more competition means we will compromise the traditional goals of regulation, which is universal access to safe and reliable electricity. I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Great. So there's a question here about EVs, about electric vehicles. So two questions. I'm not sure if this is easy to answer or not. What is the net energy efficiency of electric vehicle charging and discharging, and how can the supply of renewable generation be matched to electric vehicle demand without curtailment?
I don't think, I can't say I know the answer of the first question, but I'm not sure if it's entirely relevant. I think if you create the right market mechanism, the answers will solve for itself. For example, during peak demand time when electricity is very expensive, the EV can be used as a grid resource. You can now sell energy back to the grid, which will lower costs for all consumers. If you give that market incentive to the EV owner, by giving that market incentive to the EV owner, that actually creates more incentive for EVs. The challenge here again is that the regulation is not set up for consumers to provide grid services. And I think this is a loss if we don't allow for consumers to provide grid services, because they are making customer side investments. When a utility makes an investment, they're using ratepayer funds. And these are essentially public funds. So the more we allow customers to make private investments with their own capital, the better it is for all ratepayers.
So this is intriguing. First, a comment that both must-run fossil fuel generators and nuclear generators, as well as renewables, are poorly matched and difficult to dispatch, poorly matched to supply and demand, real time, and difficult to dispatch relative to demand. So is storage an answer to those conventional generators as well as to renewables?
Yes, I wouldn't necessarily look at storage alone. Again, you have to look at the holistic example. I think if you have more dynamic rates, I know people are fearful of dynamic rates, but with storage, it's actually quite a possibility. What I mean by dynamic rates is that sometimes nuclear energy is the most cost effective, but sometimes because nuclear needs to cycle all the time, you may need negative rates for nuclear, but in which case, the storage guy could come in and say, let me absorb that excess nuclear energy that you are producing. Similarly with solar. Solar will eventually, if the penetration is high enough, may create negative rates. So what I'm saying is that you need to create a market structure where, okay, if there's excess energy supply, encourage the customers with storage out there to absorb that energy on behalf of every other customer. That creates the grid stability. But I think storage is part of the solution, but I think we have to create the right market incentives, and some type of dynamic rates will be needed.
All right, I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions. So, you'll have to ask more afterwards with James. So, how should the losses from stranded costs be allocated? That's a big question.
That's a big question. I will defer that to the regulators, but I think we got to understand that utilities, I will say this about utilities. Utilities do have entitled for fair compensation for their assets. And what I mean is that they built these generation assets, they built this infrastructure with the understanding that they will get some type of return. Now, the question is, did they overestimate? Did they, build imprudently? And I can't tell you that. That's a case-by-case basis. But they are entitled to fair compensation. In certain cases, if the construction was imprudent, meaning, for example, they ignore the promise of distributed energy resources, perhaps they have to absorb the stranded assets. But it is a case-by-case basis.
All right, now I'm going to give you a simple one on policy. So
Yes.
how is the Clean Power Plan going to affect the grid, and how would a carbon tax affect the grid?
That's a very simple question. First of all, I think, let me answer the second question. The carbon tax, by most economics literature, would say that is the most efficient way of reducing carbon because it adds a price that's transparent to all on carbon. That way, everybody, clean utilities, clean customers can see the price and make decisions appropriately. Now, the challenge is more of a political than an economic question. People, when it comes to energy, do not want to feel pain. And politicians know that. So when you say, okay, we're going to create pain for you, voters tend to say, I'm going to vote against you. But in economic principles, creating pain, economic pain, is how you induce behavior. Now, with the carbon plan, I think the carbon plan will vary by state. And I'll be on the record, I am supportive of the carbon plan, but I'm not sure if you could categorically say what's good for which state because the mix of energy is different and the stranded, the sunk investment infrastructures are different. I would say that the more we could move away from carbon, the better, because carbon, the coal plants aren't only providing carbon, but they're also destructive in the mining processes, transportation. These are costs that are not associated in the price. And I think we got to move away from a world where we either, one, A, believe pollution should be free, or B, pollution has no cost. And we know that pollution shouldn't necessarily be free, and pollution does have a cost.
All right, thank you. Let's thank James Tong.